There are some things in Hollywood that I wish I could erase from my memory, but they've stayed with me, lingering like scars that never fully heal. I gave my boss a 6-month notice before my wedding, planning to take time off for what should have been a special moment in my life. In 3 years, I hadn't taken more than 3 days off, despite the pressure and the never-ending hustle. But when I finally asked for 2 weeks off, at minimum 5 days, I was told that I was the only one who did my job and that I was needed. Of course, a new project popped up, and suddenly my time off was reduced to just 3 days. I let it happen, and that's the worst part. I didn't stand up for myself. I let them take that from me. My first wife, and I never had a proper honeymoon. First wife, yet didn't last. As a production assistant, I had to sign more NDAs than I can count, mostly about things no one should ever have to know about celebrities. I've seen some shocking things happen between takes, things that were more about hiding a darker reality than creating art. The most disturbing part? Watching young actresses being pressured into joining their colleagues in their destructive habits. Some of these girls were barely out of high school. I was 18 too when I started as a PA, and I'll admit, I did things I shouldn't have. We all did, really. No one signed anything. We just kept our heads down. One of my friends, she was just a literal child, forced to use heroin on set just to keep her calm, to keep her from pushing back. I thought about sharing that, but then I saw your comment, and I realized my story would only add to the weight of it all. She's been through rehab so many times, trying to kick the habit, but the damage had already been done. It's hard to watch someone you care about spiral, especially when the industry you're both working in isn't there to save you. I lived in LA for about 15 years, working in the industry, and I've seen it all. But the things that aren't hidden behind non-disclosure agreements are what really shake you. Like the time I walked into a bathroom at a club and saw Lindsay Lohan snorting cocaine off the back of a toilet. It was during that infamous fire incident. She was at her absolute lowest, and yet no one said a word. I'm not married, but I've been in a long-term relationship. I never imagined I'd witness something as sickening as what I saw during Extreme Home Makeover. One of the production assistants ended up pregnant after Tiger Pennington made promises to her that were never kept. He told her he'd help her get set up in LA, but then it all fell apart, and she was forced to get an abortion. No one spoke out, and the worst part? People knew. Then there was the married executive producer who texted me at 3 o'clock in the morning, trying to pressure me into sleeping with him. I rejected him outright, but he was furious. When I told others about it, he tried to brush it off as a joke. "You should lighten up," he said. But it wasn't a joke. It was a violation. The same pattern of predatory behavior continued with another executive producer who allowed rumors to swirl about us sleeping together. When I confronted him, all he did was chuckle and pat my head, dismissing me with a, "Oh, they won't believe me anyway." It was as if my dignity didn't even matter. I once witnessed a cast member on a reality show get groped by a stranger, right on camera. The executive producer refused to stop filming, refused to let her process what happened in private. We couldn't even pause to give her a moment of dignity. After the man was escorted out, I begged to give her some space, but they pushed ahead as if nothing had happened. It still haunts me. And let me not forget the 50 or 60-year-old director of photography, clearly exploiting a naive 18-year-old assistant camera operator. She came to me one day, asking if I could take her to get Plan B, because she had never seen an obstetrician or gynecologist before, and her family wouldn't allow her to. It's heartbreaking knowing that the women around me, who should have been protected, were being used as stepping stones for the careers of men like him. And the worst part? The female executive producer and the production manager knew all about it. And not only did they ignore it, but they also encouraged it. This is just the tip of the iceberg. The stories I've shared are only a glimpse of the reality behind the curtains, things that no one talks about, things that aren't protected by NDAs. These are the parts of Hollywood that you don't see in the glamour shots or on the red carpet. This is the truth, and it stays with you long after you leave. I've spent most of my career dealing with the real-life side of things, not the glamorous set pieces you see on screen. But the most unforgettable moment I had wasn't on set. It happened while I was sitting at a bus stop on Santa Monica Boulevard. An older Mercedes rolled up to the red light, its windows down, and classical music blared out into the street, filling the air with a sense of grandeur. As I glanced up, I saw a wild, untamed mass of dark, curly hair and realized in that moment it was her. I knew then I was witnessing something rare, something raw, a true badass moment. One of those glimpses into Hollywood that tells you everything you need to know about the world behind the lights. Of course, the lighter moments of this industry aren't much less disturbing than the darker ones. Honestly, I'm more curious about the stories covered by NDAs. Those are often more intriguing to me. But in my experience, the NDA stuff isn't as grim as you might think. I went into this business fully aware of the potential for chaos and scandal. I armed myself with a solid mix of resting bitch face and non-resting bitch face, always ready to speak up and call out the nonsense. Sure, it cost me some work opportunities here and there, but I never got myself into a situation that truly threatened my safety. Surviving Hollywood means not trusting anyone, and that mindset helped me stay grounded through it all. There's one thing, though, that still sends chills down my spine. I wasn't directly involved, but I was a production coordinator on a show where one of the cameramen followed an actress back to her hotel room. What he tried to do to her was horrific. Thankfully, she managed to fight him off and get help before it escalated further. The guy was fired and charged, but the actress rightfully quit. She didn't feel safe anymore. He had a 20-year career, and it breaks my heart to think this probably wasn't the first time he did something like this, but it was the first time anyone was brave enough to speak up. That was terrifying. I have no idea what happened to the actress after she left the show, but I truly hope she's doing well. Hollywood is a brutal, competitive world. I remember a young actress, beautiful and talented, complaining that she needed to lose just 5 pounds. One of her so-called competitors actually told her to use crack to lose the weight, assuring her that if she only did it 3 times a week, she wouldn't get hooked. That girl sprinted out of the room so fast. I couldn't even process what I had just heard. I couldn't understand it. Complaining about needing to lose 5 to 8 pounds in an industry that values appearance over all else? It doesn't make sense to me. If your deadline for losing weight is over a week, but less than a month, there are healthy and sustainable ways to do it. But if you're already underweight, that's a different story. Despite seeing more than my fair share of drug use and egos running wild, my most unsettling moment came from an encounter with Gary Busey. It's a memory that still lingers, unsettling in the most disturbing way. He put on a ginger dead man mask, grabbed my face with both hands, and screamed at the top of his lungs. That's a part of my soul that I feel has just vanished. It was a moment I'll never forget. Something visceral, a reminder that Hollywood isn't always the glittering fantasy it seems to be. While I lived in LA, I had a little dog named Tom, and I had a chance to see Tom Cruise in person. Let me tell you, he's incredibly nice, almost to the point where it's unsettling. There's this warmth in his smile, but his eyes, there's nothing there. It's like he's performing kindness, but there's a coldness underneath. It reminds me of something Mary Harron, the director of American Psycho, said about Christian Bale. She mentioned that Bale used Tom Cruise as inspiration for his performance, noting how Cruise exudes this intense, almost manic friendliness without anything behind the eyes. There's something about him, creepy but fascinating. Then there's a rumor that circulated in the Korean film industry about a famous actor who tried to make it big in Hollywood. He starred in a few Hollywood blockbusters, but there were whispers, unsettling rumors, that he had an inappropriate relationship with his sister. She was always with him, following him everywhere, even on set. At first, I thought it was just to protect a brother, but after speaking to some people, it was clear this was far from innocent. Everyone I spoke to was serious about it, treating it as common knowledge. It was one of those Hollywood stories you hear, and you can't shake it, even though you wish you could. What's even stranger is that this actor was pretty close with the son of one of my mom's friends, a Korean-American guy. He lived with them for a while, near LA, and worked tirelessly on improving his English. I don't know what happened to him after his role in Ninja Assassin. It's funny, I sometimes wonder where he ended up. Leah, if I recall correctly. After that, I guess he just disappeared into the Hollywood abyss. I was part of the LA scene in the 90s, working on the outskirts of the industry, but my company was responsible for printing a lot of movie posters. We saw the stars, the glamour, but we also saw the chaos behind the scenes, the untold stories that the public never hears about. It's like you're standing on the edge of something massive, and yet, you never really know what's beneath the surface until you take a deep dive into the mess that is Hollywood. I've seen a lot of things over the years, mostly when delivering proofs and running errands between different studios and offices. But the real eye-opening experiences happened when I worked a second, part-time job at Banana Republic. Most of the people who worked there were aspiring actors, writers, and creatives trying to make it big. The store often provided wardrobe for TV shows, so the line between the personal and professional worlds blurred constantly. It was like being at the crossroads of so many lives, where party invitations and industry gossip mixed with the mundane. I spent more nights than I care to count at house parties where the air was thick with the smell of cocaine, with mountains of it casually stacked on coffee tables. It was as if it were just another party favor passed around by someone from within the industry. Mind-boggling, really, to witness how casually it was dealt with, how intertwined it all was. But here's a story I'll always cherish. Once, I helped Alan Rickman find a pair of pants. He was incredibly down-to-earth, charming in a way that was so rare in Hollywood. I remember ringing him up, carefully wrapping his things, and handing him his bag with a polite, "Here are your pants, Mr. Rickman." What happened next still makes me smile. He turned to the line of people behind him, flashed a grin, and proclaimed, "Yes, these are Alan Rickman's trousers," in his signature dry voice. It was such an unexpectedly human moment, and I'll never forget the warmth in his laughter. As for the trousers, well, they were one charcoal, one maroon, flat front. And no, I don't remember the size, but it doesn't matter. The moment is what stuck with me, the kind of encounter that reminds you of the real people behind the star-studded images. I also learned a few things that shattered the perfect image the public often has of people in the spotlight. Take Marie Osmond, for instance. The wholesome, godly Mormon image everyone associates with her? Turns out it's not as pristine as it seems. I went to college with one of her grandchildren, and the image they projected was one of pure, perfect Mormon values, a family bound by their faith. Yet, behind the scenes, the pressure was suffocating, especially with the constant need to maintain a spotless public image. They were expected to be paragons of virtue in body, mind, and action, constantly under scrutiny, even from their own church. It was a strange juxtaposition to witness the undercurrents of their lives. I don't know if it was her specifically, but I remember the pressure surrounding her family like it was a second skin, one they could never shed, no matter how badly they might want to. Then there was that one time, when I was 20 or 21, about to board a plane to Romania for a low-budget film shoot. I had no idea what I was getting into, and as I was loading up into a van to head to the airport, the producer handed me a blank envelope. "I need you to give this to Vlad when you get there," he said. I opened it when I was alone, $25,000 in cash, stuffed into the envelope. He made it clear, "Don't declare it at customs." I was so young, and honestly, I didn't know what to think. But when I realized the envelope barely held the money without bulging, I got nervous. That was a lot of cash to fit into something so flimsy, but I did it, kept it hidden in my carry-on bag, trying not to act suspicious. It felt like a crime in the making, but it wasn't my place to ask questions. I just followed orders. Looking back, I wonder how many people like me have been asked to do things like that without ever knowing the full scope of what's really going on behind the scenes. Hollywood's toxicity, especially when it comes to older men preying on young women, is undeniable. It's sickening to witness, and it's even more disturbing when you realize how normalized it is. I walked onto a set once after being out in the rain, drenched through to my skin. A sound guy, someone I'd never met, looked me up and down and casually muttered, "Wet tits." He said it in front of other colleagues, without a shred of shame. And no one said a word. I was new, fresh to the industry, so I laughed it off, but inside I was seething. I would never tolerate that now. But back then, I felt small, like I didn't have the power to stand up for myself. It's a feeling I'll never forget. Then there was my time working for an indie film company towards the end of the doom boom, a period when the industry was growing faster than it could handle. The bosses had rented a massive, multi-floor office space, loaded with desks and computers that were barely ever used. We were a skeleton crew, doing more pretending than actual work. When a group of VC investors were scheduled to visit, the higher-ups panicked. They had us run around like chickens with our heads cut off, setting up fake workstations, filling empty chairs with jackets and coffee cups. It was all an illusion, meant to make us look like a bustling, thriving company. The deception was shameless, and we all felt sick to our stomachs for having to participate in it. It felt like we were playing a game of deceit, but the stakes were real. It's funny, in a sad way, how similar it is to a story I heard about Accuracy International, the company that won the UK Army's contract for sniper rifles in the early 90s. They developed the best rifle, hands down, but when military brass visited their shop, they were shocked by how small the operation was. Turns out, the rifle that won the contest was designed by just 2 guys in a garage. The irony is almost too much to process, but it just goes to show how much of Hollywood and the world beyond is built on appearances, illusions, and lies. They rented a fully equipped workshop for a day, filling it with rifle barrels, tools, and other gear. Everything meticulously staged to impress. When the brass arrived, they stayed for a mere few minutes, nodded approvingly, and declared, "Looks good." It was all a show, a carefully crafted illusion designed to convince the powers that be. It didn't matter that it wasn't real. But the deception was so blatant, it made you question everything about the industry. I may not work in the entertainment world myself, but I've crossed paths with plenty who do, and the stories I've heard are jaw-dropping. One of my favorites revolves around a delay during the filming of Black Hawk Down. Apparently, the entire shoot was postponed because Tom Sawyer developed a severe facial infection after a Moroccan called Lady Pete, a local delicacy, was applied to his face. Apparently, this was why Sawyer kept his helmet on the entire movie. He didn't want anyone to see the infection. But what followed was even stranger. My husband's friend, who had worked as Sawyer's driver years ago, ended up in prison because of him. They got pulled over one night in Connecticut after Sawyer insisted they speed to a location. The cops found a mountain of drugs in the car, and Sawyer promptly threw his driver under the bus, claiming that all the drugs belonged to him. The police just took his word for it, and my husband's friend went to prison for something he didn't do. Sawyer never told the truth about what happened. The man was released later, but tragically passed away shortly after due to an untreated ear infection. Prison healthcare, as you can imagine, is atrocious. What a disgrace. But the worst part is how Sawyer never once took responsibility for it. Never once acknowledged the harm he'd caused. The man he wronged, my husband's friend, passed away not long ago. I guess we can all say good riddance. Moving away from the tragic, there's still the gross, sometimes almost comical side of things. I worked on a show once where the lead actor would deliberately stuff himself with raw garlic, onions, and canned tuna before kissing scenes. It was his sick, twisted way of asserting power over the actresses he was paired with. It was a clear manipulation tactic designed to make them feel uncomfortable, as if he had the upper hand. It's something Jennifer Lawrence openly admitted to doing on the Hunger Games set. But here's the kicker. It wasn't her I worked with on this particular project. The fact that this behavior has become somewhat normalized, even in such a competitive, high-pressure environment, just speaks volumes about the toxic side of the industry. One particularly disconcerting experience happened during a commercial shoot with bodybuilders. The producer, without a hint of hesitation, casually asked the client if they wanted to oil up the bodybuilders for the shoot. Without any shame, the client agreed, and a group of men were then tasked with spending the next 30 minutes massaging oil all over the bodybuilders' half-naked, sweaty bodies. The bodybuilders, clearly uncomfortable, had no choice but to endure it, standing there like statues as the oil was applied. At the time, everyone on set laughed and joked about it. It felt like an innocent, albeit awkward, situation. But looking back, it was messed up. It was dehumanizing, reducing these men to mere props in a photo shoot, their discomfort ignored for the sake of aesthetics. The power dynamics were so out of balance, yet at the time, no one even questioned it. Then there's the side of the industry that has nothing to do with the celebrities themselves, yet it's just as disturbing. One of the most jarring moments I witnessed happened when a 22-year-old production assistant, exhausted after a grueling 14-hour shoot, climbed into a large white truck at 1 a.m. to drive back home from a remote location. She had a few beers and some bumps to keep her going, and yet, there she was preparing to drive through the night, completely sleep-deprived. I've heard too many stories of accidents caused by workers in similar situations. People breaking under the strain of overwork and exhaustion. It's a cycle that's hard to break. one that almost caught up with me during a shoot that lasted 3 days. After 14-hour days, working far outside of town, driving back home on barely any sleep, I found myself nodding off at the wheel. I was so close to crashing. That was the moment I decided that I couldn't continue working in this industry. The toll it takes on your body, your mind, is just not worth it. And finally, the ultimate horror. A stunt double for Jonathan Majors showed up on set one day in full blackface. I don't even have the words to describe the visceral shock I felt. In an industry where image is everything, where every move is scrutinized, to witness something so egregiously offensive, so blatantly disrespectful, was both disturbing and enraging. The fact that it happened on set, in full view of everyone, says so much about the deep-rooted issues of racism and insensitivity that continue to permeate Hollywood. No amount of apologies can ever take away the damage caused by those actions, the harm done to the community, the generations of progress we've lost because of these attitudes. The excuse given was that there simply weren't any black stunt doubles available in New Mexico, which of course only made the situation worse. The stuntman was understandably furious. He stood there, fuming with disbelief, while the rest of us awkwardly watched. You could feel the tension in the air. Everyone felt uncomfortable. It was one of those moments where you were caught between trying to stay neutral and wanting to scream. That was an experience that stuck with me for a long time. I once worked as a line producer's assistant on an indie film in Vancouver. The film was plagued with financial problems from the start, and we were getting closer and closer to missing payroll. Twice. The money was supposed to come from the Middle East, but things just weren't lining up. Tension thickened, and it was clear that this project was on the verge of collapse. One day, the head of the Teamsters, who was also a Hells Angels captain, pulled the producers aside. In a voice colder than ice, he said, "Hand over your passports, or I'll take you out back and break both your legs. You'll get them back when everyone's been paid what they're owed." The producers, shaking, handed over their passports like a humiliated criminal. It was a chilling reminder of how precarious the industry can be when money is tight. I had another unnerving experience volunteering at the Toronto International Film Festival. An actress, one of the stars of the show, had overdosed in the bathroom just before she was scheduled to do a Q&A. It was a surreal, chaotic moment. Someone from the film crew managed to get her stable enough to go on stage. She did the Q&A in a daze, barely holding herself together, before they finally called an ambulance. But the fact that she was able to perform at all, in that state, spoke volumes about the pressures of the industry. It's as if her worth as a person, her health, didn't matter compared to the show she had to put on. Then there was the time, around 2005, when a well-known TV celebrity was caught on an open hot mic, bragging about how he'd go about assaulting women, groping them, and kissing them without their consent. He said, "You can get away with it when you're famous." It was disgusting. Not only the actions, but the casualness with which he spoke about them. And what was even worse, he didn't lose his job. In fact, his popularity skyrocketed, despite his revolting words. His acting, which was mediocre at best, was now celebrated as if it was somehow connected to his authentic persona. Meanwhile, his fans, some of whom were deeply vocal about their belief in wild conspiracy theories, continued to support him, even after the world heard him speak about his predatory behavior in his own voice. They simply refused to accept the truth. For them, Hollywood was this dark, nefarious place, a breeding ground for exploitation, even as they continued to cheer for a man who was a living example of what they claimed to abhor. It was a twisted irony, and it made me wonder how deep the denial really runs in some people. And yet, as disturbing as all of that was, it wasn't even the most shocking thing I witnessed in my 25 years in the industry. I later read about how he was found liable for assaulting more than 20 women, with at least one of them being underage at the time of the incident. The rot was deep, and no one seemed to want to confront it head-on. It was as if the system itself was complicit, allowing such behavior to fester. I also worked on an end-of-the-world type show that filmed in Texas back in the early 2010s. It was my third production as a production assistant, but my first time working in the general office, and I was excited. The cast was full of people I admired. One in particular was a legendary actress from one of the biggest cult TV shows of the 2000s. She played one of my favorite characters, But then there was this strange, baffling thing that kept coming up. Word spread among the wardrobe crew about this actress, how she frequently had her period during filming, and not just once, but repeatedly. What baffled everyone was how she acted like it was no big deal. She didn't make any effort to prevent the issue from occurring. The show was set in a time period where continuity was crucial, and the clothes were often subject to aging and dyeing procedures to give them the right look. This constant disruption meant the clothes had to be re-washed, re-aged, and readied. It caused an immense amount of redundant work for the crew, especially in the costuming department, who had to deal with the same pieces over and over again. It started as just a minor open secret, a joke around the set about how quirky the actress was, how hippy-dippy she seemed. But the situation became increasingly inconvenient as the filming continued. Eventually, the costumers were left redoing their work far too often, all because of this one issue. But here's the thing. No one ever really questioned if there was something deeper going on with the actress's health. It didn't seem like a medical condition at all. She just handled it with such nonchalance, as though it was perfectly normal. To her, it seemed like nothing, but to the crew, it became a kind of ongoing absurdity. It shifted my perception of her completely, turning me from a loyal fan to someone who was just a little more neutral about her. It was as if she was completely disconnected from the impact her actions had on those around her. The whole thing left me shaking my head. But in the end, this was just another example of the weirdness that exists in this business, something that most people never get to see from the outside. And, well, free bleeding? It's real. It's a thing. I can't quite wrap my head around it, but apparently it's a thing. Some people do it, and while I don't fully understand, I try to respect that. Honestly, when I first heard about it, I was completely oblivious. I never imagined this was something that people would actually make a practice of. But then again, who am I to judge? I'm just a CS guy, and I really don't have the place to pass judgment on what any woman chooses to do with her body. It's her choice, right? Still, there was something about this situation that felt oddly uncomfortable. It seemed like it had gone beyond personal preference and crossed into something that just didn't sit right. Let me tell you about another bizarre moment I had while working with some of LA's wealthiest and most eccentric folks. We work with all kinds of vendors, setting up home theaters, handling high-end tech, and taking care of some bizarre random requests. One of the most bizarre experiences, however, came when we were at Tom Cruise's house. I'm not even talking about anything particularly outlandish or scandalous. It was just how incredibly weird he was about people having phones in his house. It wasn't like he had a ton of secretive, creepy stuff hidden away. It was just his attitude that was so off-putting. He had this unshakable fear that everyone was there to snap pictures of his personal belongings, as though we were all waiting for an opportunity to sneak a photo of something. Anything, just to get a glimpse into his world. It was such a strange dynamic. Honestly, I can't say I blame him entirely. I'm sure he's been burned before by the paparazzi. They'll stop at nothing to get a shot. But it was eye-opening to witness firsthand how paranoia and suspicion can grow when you're surrounded by people who seem to only want to exploit your every move. And I'll tell you, the things I've heard and seen from the paparazzi are just plain disgusting. They'll scream the most horrible, abusive insults right in celebrities' faces, just to provoke a response. Anything to get a reaction that will sell a story. It's ugly, it's invasive, and it's completely dehumanizing. What's worse is that some celebrities get the worst of it, having to live their lives like they're under constant surveillance with no privacy. The level of cruelty these photographers will sink to in order to get the shot is unimaginable. As someone who's worked in the industry for over 35 years, I've witnessed my fair share of outrageous and often disturbing behavior on set, drug use, sexual misconduct, you name it. But there's one story that I'll never forget. I once caught a famous Oscar-winning actress emerging from her trailer. And here's the kicker. She was stuffing rolls of cheap, single-ply toilet paper into her expensive Hermes backpack. Now, don't get me wrong, I get it. People have quirks. But this was something else. Let me set the scene for you. She was staying in a penthouse suite in the best hotel in Vancouver. She could have easily called the concierge and had 2 full cases of premium toilet paper delivered to her door within the hour without batting an eye. But no, she had to steal this cheap, flimsy stuff from her Winnebago. And it wasn't even a small amount. She was packing it away like she was preparing for the apocalypse. If the guy in charge of the supply department hadn't noticed, he would have gotten in serious trouble. It's just the kind of absurdity that seems to happen behind the scenes, and it left me shaking my head. Now, let me tell you something that really grinds my gears: the way production assistants, PAs, are treated. I work as a first assistant camera on film and TV sets, and I've seen how awfully PAs are treated. They are often at the bottom of the totem pole, doing the most grueling, thankless work, running errands, getting coffee, moving equipment, just to pay their dues and learn the ropes. And for all of this, many of them are working unpaid. They're there just to get experience. Yet they're treated like invisible cogs in a machine, expected to handle the worst tasks without a word of thanks. It's infuriating. They may be at the bottom of the ladder, but they're also the ones making everything run smoothly. I've seen so many productions go smoothly thanks to the hard work of the PAs. They're the unsung heroes of every shoot, big or small. So, a special shout out to them. Thank you for dealing with the mundane, the tiresome, and often the degrading tasks that no one else wants to do. But you get it done, and you do it with a smile. Without you, nothing would work. So, don't let anyone treat you like your work doesn't matter. Respect to the PAs. You make the magic happen, even when no one notices. I remember being on a shoot years ago where the director of photography, a seasoned veteran, was absolutely brutal to a young production assistant. She was just starting out, eager, doing her best, but he wasn't having any of it. Every little thing she did was met with harsh criticism, as if she was invisible. He'd shout at her, belittle her over the smallest mistakes, and drop these snide, cutting remarks. It was hard to watch. Honestly, the way he treated her was disgusting, and yet she took it all in stride. But fast forward 9 years, and it's like the world flipped on him. This young PA, who had endured his nonsense and learned from it, had worked her way up in the industry. She'd become a powerful, respected producer in no time. And one day, that same DP, now vying for a huge feature film, walked into a studio meeting, expecting to land the job of a lifetime. But sitting across from him were the producers, including the very PA he had once tormented. To say he didn't get the job would be an understatement. It was a silent revenge, a cosmic reminder that karma has a way of working itself out. You never know who you'll cross paths with again, or how those early decisions, those moments of arrogance, will come back to bite you. This is why I always tell anyone who dreams of entering this industry, be careful how you treat people, especially those you think are beneath you. It may feel like you're on top today, but tomorrow, that person you dismissed could be the one holding your future in their hands. Karma is a merciless beast, and it doesn't forget. And when it comes to my shoots, I make it crystal clear to everyone around me: treat the PAs with respect. I don't care how stressful things get, or how high-strung the situation might be. If anyone dares to disrespect a PA, they're gone immediately. I don't care if they're the lowest person on the call sheet. Respect is not optional. We are all part of the same team, no matter where we stand in the hierarchy. It's not just about being professional, it's about human decency. Speaking of behavior on set, let me tell you about a particularly bizarre moment I witnessed on a shoot for a film called Big Gold Brick. It wasn't so much wild as it was just off. Andy Garcia, the actor, got into a physical altercation with his co-star in between takes. Now, I don't know what exactly sparked the incident, but it was clear that tension had been building for weeks between them. Andy had been drinking, and maybe the frustrations had finally boiled over. I'll tell you, it was uncomfortable to witness, especially because Emery, his co-star, handled the whole thing with such incredible professionalism. He didn't retaliate, didn't escalate. He just stayed calm and collected like a true pro. And that's something that always sticks with me. How class and restraint can turn a volatile situation into something more manageable. Emery was a stand-up guy, and that's rare to find in this business. And then there's the story of a makeup artist who came into my store for a special event. She was doing these 10-minute one-on-ones with clients, consulting, answering questions, and applying makeup. The event started without a hitch, and the clients were all pleased with her work. She was polished, professional, and gave off this aura of someone who had everything together. But once the event wrapped up and everyone left, something happened that I didn't expect. I was walking toward one of the offices, and I heard these sounds, soft howls and what sounded like crying. I approached the source of the noise, and there she was curled up on the floor in tears. Her makeup, which had been flawless just hours ago, was streaked down her face, leaving a trail of smudged color on her clothes and shoes. It was a heart-wrenching sight. I stood there, trying to stay unnoticed, but I couldn't help but overhear her on the phone. She was crying so hard, saying, "I can't do this anymore. I hate pretending I enjoy doing this. If I didn't need the money, I would have stopped years ago." Her voice cracked, and I could feel her anguish from across the room. She was trapped in a life she didn't want anymore. As she hung up the phone, she quickly pulled a scarf from her bag, wrapped it around herself like some kind of cloak of invisibility, put on a pair of oversized sunglasses, and tried to gather herself. She stood up, looking like someone who had just experienced a deep, personal collapse, and walked out of the room in a hurry, trying to remain unseen. I couldn't help but feel sadness for her. She was so successful, so talented, yet she was doing something she despised. I could only imagine how often she'd had to hide behind that professional mask. Was it worth it? The fame, the clients, the money. Did any of it make up for the fact that she was miserable? As she left, I couldn't stop thinking, is she still doing makeup? Does she still feel the same way? Last I heard, she's still working in the industry, but something tells me that passion she once had for the art of makeup has been replaced with something else. Something a lot more empty. I believe his last name was Doug Hutcherson, a man who had once made a name for himself teaching kids in Hollywood. If there's one thing I can say for certain, it's that money can't buy you the happiness of a truly content family. Take, for example, watching Jimmy Fallon, whose comedic stylings have always struck me as forced. Losing his temper on air, spiraling into a full-blown tantrum when he was finally let go from his position. It's remarkable how years later, he's still caught in that same emotional whirlpool, unable to escape the grip of that unrelenting frustration. I can't even begin to fathom the kind of intense pressure Doug must have been under, day in and day out, trying to make Fallon appear funny on screen. It's a tough job, especially when the person you're working with isn't naturally gifted in that area. And in Jimmy's case, unfortunately, he's one of the most unfunny people I've ever had the displeasure of meeting. Ironically, that lack of humor seemed to work perfectly with Doug's own way of navigating Hollywood's shallow, glittering world. As for me, I've spent years working in the world of fashion marketing, moving between various small and massive companies. I wear many hats. Usually, I'm behind the camera, either as a photographer or as an assistant handling the lighting. But in the last couple of years, my career has taken a turn towards more unpredictable roles, from styling photo shoots to working with models or even music artists. I vividly remember the time I had to guide a male model through an underwear shoot and, quite unexpectedly, tell him to stuff a piece of Wonder Bread around his groin area beneath the briefs. The reason? To create a smoother, fuller look. It was an absurd request, but apparently it worked. No, I didn't inspect the results, in case you were wondering. But my job doesn't just involve being on set for these unusual moments. As a talent representative, it's not uncommon for clients to call in the middle of a shoot, informing us that the production crew is asking them to do something that wasn't part of the original script. In most cases, it's either a stunt that the client is expected to do themselves instead of relying on a stunt performer, or it's a situation where a female model is asked to do nudity that was never agreed upon. Thankfully, these kinds of issues can usually be resolved with a simple phone call to the producer. "Hey, this isn't what we signed up for," and most of the time, they'll accept that and move forward without incident. Every so often, though, like maybe 5 times in the entire span of my career, something absolutely bizarre happens. I'll never forget the time a client called me from a remote set in one of the flyover states. He was on set, and the production crew was demanding that he manually induce an elephant to climax. Yes, you read that correctly. The first thing he shouted into the phone as soon as I answered was, "They want me to jerk off an elephant." You can imagine how surreal that moment was. Resolving that one took days. Since the shoot was in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't physically go there to handle it, but my client was adamant. He wasn't going to do it, no matter what. The production team, on the other hand, was insistent. As for the animal rights team, supposed to be overseeing everything, I have no idea what they were doing in all of this. In the end, My client stayed holed up in his hotel room until the situation was sorted out, which ultimately ended with him refusing to perform the act. It was one of the most absurd things I've ever dealt with in my career. But even that wasn't the weirdest part of my job. The strangest experience I had was when one of my clients had their private tapes leaked to the public, and the conversations surrounding that were, at best, uncomfortable. I'm still grappling with the strange ethical boundaries of the entire situation. It's hard to comprehend how anyone could justify asking someone to engage with an animal in such an intimate and inappropriate manner for the sake of a scene. What I can say with some certainty, however, is that the production was more about pushing limits and humiliating my client, testing just how far he was willing to go for a paycheck.